Hello, and welcome to the relaunch of the Positunity podcast. Yes, you heard me correctly, the relaunch. And I promise that is the focus of this episode, and we'll get there. But first things first, I want to start with an actual Positunity in the direction of the relaunch. So let's start there, shall we? Happy New Year, everyone, and thank you for joining me. 2025 is here. Wow. It's weird to say, but that is where our journey begins because we were celebrating New Year's Eve with friends. The evening started with sushi at a local, I'm not going to name it, place, although it was delicious and amazing. We had planned the New Year's Eve shindig just a couple of days earlier with this group of us who had no other plans. It worked out perfectly. So the others in our group arrived before us because my partner and I were primping. It was New Year's Eve, guys. Even though this wasn't a fancy place, Mike and I were getting dressed up. Even though it was ending in pajamas and games later, it was New Year's Eve. Were we overdressed for the venue? No, New Year's Eve. Were we overdressed compared to every other patron? Absolutely yes. I was wearing red velvet and Mike was wearing black sequins. And before you fast forward thinking, what can this possibly have to do with the story? Trust me, these two details are crucial. So we sit down, the 5 gays in a corner. 5 gays walk into a sushi place on New Year's Eve and the hostess says, no, I couldn't help but go there, but I digress. Anyway, there are people on either side of our table, but for this, we're only concerned about the one table with the 2 little girls and their dad. The girls were both in oversized t-shirts of the place where we were eating. Like the other tables at the restaurant, I didn't actually notice this table until one of our sushi orders came out. Let's just say it involved fire. Listen, I thought it was cool, so of course, the 2 girls from the table behind us were fascinated. I thought it was adorable how they were practically leaning on the shoulders of the 2 across the table from Mike and me. Yes, me. Argue. Me. Anyway, I digress again. So another roll came out, and we repeated the same situation with the girls over the shoulder, staring at everything that happened at the table. Fast forward to the end of dinner. There are more details, but we need to skip and we'll circle back. We're finished, sitting around the table talking, when one of the girls from the table behind us comes over, and I'm not kidding when I say comes over. See, there was a bench wall at our table, so she came between the bench and the table into our space to hand Mike the napkin. He quickly said something like, "Thanks." "It's just a note," said the little girl. "Oh, a note. Thank you," Mike repeated, feigning excitement. Here's what the note said. Yes, I took a picture. "Your jackets," with an S, "your jackets is so cool. I hope you have an amazing new year. That jacket deserves it. Willow and Lyric." You guys, is that the cutest thing ever? These girls were young. I mean, the oldest was maybe 6. I was going to say 8, but there's a reason I'm thinking younger. See, the note was written by the dad. I know it was written by the dad. 1, it was written on a napkin with a ballpoint pen. These girls would have struggled to do that. 2, the writing was very neat. I'm not going to show the note, but we'll come back to that. Listen, the dad wrote the note for the girls because 3, neither of the names was stylized or better than the other, which would have been the case if one of the girls wrote it themselves. Herself. Anyway, I digress again. This note made the other 4 people at the table ooh and ah to exhaustion when Mike jumped in. They have been staring at me the whole meal. It has been so uncomfortable and awkward. I've been trying not to look at them and not pay attention to them paying attention to me, but oh my gosh. Positunity time. Listen, I do feel bad for Mike feeling uncomfortable. As a gay man, you are never quite sure where people's heads might be at any given moment, despite where you might be physically. Also, as an adult who has been stared at by a child awkwardly and had to try not to notice because their parents certainly aren't, I get it. So Mike, I'm sorry. That said, back to the Positunity. So these girls have been obsessed with the black sequin jacket all night long. Not only are they in love with the jacket, but they convinced their dad, again, 99% sure he's a straight man, to write this letter for them. These two girls stared at Mike all night, then convinced their dad, when the check came and he had a pen, to write a letter on a napkin to this gay man at the table next to them, who was obviously going to share it with everyone at the table. I know, I'm not a father. And fathers will go to extreme lengths for their daughters. But write a letter to a table of strange gays? Come on. Now, even our group debated who wrote the note, whether they were on our team or not, or had influence on the language used. I don't care. This dad wrote that letter. I know he was not comfortable with it, because once he'd given the letter, he never looked our direction again. I'm not saying he didn't just not make eye contact or look past or through us. I mean, he didn't look left again, period. He did it for them. That's a Positunity. Are you kidding me? Hashtag sushi dad? That was incredible. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing it for your daughters. Thank you for doing it for me. Thank you for doing it for our table. Thank you for doing it, period. Now look, I was taken aback and I didn't Positunity him. Again, the relaunch and the direction that this is going. When I see something like this happen, yes, it's going to come on the show. But I also want to use it to grow the cause by gifting Positunity notices. They're just QR code, folks. I should have given this man one that night after dinner and said thank you. I missed that Positunity, but I will not miss it again. The notices are arriving this week, so I will always have them to distribute. But if you know how to find this man, Sushi Dad in Salt Lake City, he was maybe late 20s, early 30s, white and gray camo puffy coat. I would say fairly tall and curly dark brown hair for the sake of this. I guess I have to say it was Ito Sushi in Fort Union on New Year's Eve around 7 p.m. when the note was passed. In any case, it really touched me the more I thought about it, and it made me want to share it to start this relaunch. You know, I took a break from this for a minute for a lot of reasons. I was kind of doing stuff in the background, but as you know, there haven't actually been any episodes published. So let's talk about that. You know, I launched and I was super excited. I was ready to do this. It was fun when I was doing it, and I absolutely loved it. But the truth of the matter was, I wasn't being true to myself. That's not fair. The stories I was telling were true, but what I wanted to say, how I wanted to say it, and the scope of what I wanted to do was not included in what I was doing. And that came from kind of just launching without having an idea of where it was going to go or what I wanted to do. And also, I didn't have any guests. But the more I went back and read my stories, that's not what I wanted this to be. And obviously, it's my podcast, so my voice is going to be here, and my experiences are going to be part of it. But it's not what I want Positunity to be. It's not what I envisioned it to be. So welcome to the relaunch. It's taken a long minute, but here we go. And I do have a plan to keep things going, because I'm not going to base it on my stories and or new interpretations of them. I want it to be a bit of the conversations of today, ergo my recent Positunity, but also current events and Positunities there. So Positunity started originally as a positive opportunity, Positunity. As I did that, though, I realized if you split that up, and you can see in the podcast logo behind me, Positunity also came from that. I'm getting a new sign, but I didn't want to hold this up while I waited for that, so this is just your temporary one. But that's kind of what started me thinking about that direction, and I was going and that I actually wanted to go. As I thought about that, this new direction, it's about the unity we have rather than division. So I want to posit that unity is much stronger than division and can bring us together if we focus on that unity. I want to put out there and show that we have more in common than we do that divides us. That's hard because when we focus on things that divide us, it's easy to see the chasm below and not know where the bottom is or how to get across. But I posit that when we focus on what we have in common, we find out that the gap between us isn't that wide. Even though it might be deep, it's not that wide. So what we have to do is come together in a way that we can reach each other, to bridge that gap by coming back to the things we agree on. This is how I got thinking about the podcast. I don't want to make it all about these deeply polar and dividing issues. I don't want to focus there, even though those are the things that we will talk about because those are the things that are coming up. But I want it to be talking about the people involved. Right now we focus on the regulations, the what, the things. The difference is that we're not talking about the people. Because when we make it about things and not people, it's easy for us to other. It's easy to other things or them. Not an actual who, but a fictitious group that we put everyone in to make them a who. It's easier to other things than it is to other a person. But the result of othering things is someone, a person, a real person somewhere actually gets hurt. That's what I want this to be, is a conversation. And yes, it will bring in my past experiences. And yes, I want to have guests and experiences from their life, but I want to talk about what unites us in a subject or life in general, rather than what divides us. I'm going to use the example of speech, but the truth is it can extend to any number of topics. Originally, I wanted a much more controversial topic, but that's not the way to relaunch a podcast. I even thought about religion. In order for you to practice whatever your religion, I need to be able to be free from religion, and someone else needs to utilize elements in their sacrament that might be controversial or potentially illegal, and not getting into the weeds there. So speech it is. In order for me to be able to say what I want, when I want, how I want, ergo this podcast, Donald Trump needs to be able to say what he wants as a private citizen, or the Pope, or Congress, or my Mormon neighbor, or even that guy swearing on the subway. Okay, this one gets into a discussion here because the thing is, we have to remember that my freedom ends where your freedom begins. The gap between freedoms, that gap that I mentioned before, we don't know how wide it is, but in order for me to be free, I have to allow you the same, equal, and opposing freedoms, which means I have to allow for someone else to speak regardless of my personal feelings. This may be a simplified example, but there shouldn't be an overreaching requirement of what you have to do when it may not be in the best interest of you, your family, the ones you love. Why should a bunch of people who do not know me, you, them, do not know the situation, have any control over what we say? If we have to put into law that you can't say, I hate the president, when things change, but the regulation stays, you now have to deal with those consequences regardless. So freedom is about choice. It's about talking, and talking before the divide is too wide. It's not about going to polar opposites. It's not about binary choices in life. Rarely is life either or. That's the relaunch. That's not the direction I was going. I was going to my stories and talking about them and reanalyzing them. And I don't want to do that. Yes, past informs the present and the future, but I don't need to rehash those things. They can inform the conversations we're having here and now. It's why I needed to relaunch this, to refocus. And I hope you're ready and willing to join that journey. It's not a complete about-face, just a refocus of where the podcast should go. I also got thinking about how that happened in the podcast because it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. That said, I do want this to be about personal things and how we evolve and realize where we are and what we may be doing right or wrong for ourselves. What is happening now that I might not have looked at or thought about before? The reason I'm saying all this is I recognize what I was doing with the podcast is something I do with a lot of things in my life. And maybe something in my subconscious was avoiding the conversation because ultimately I'm a people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, which is again why I want to keep this podcast non-confrontational. If it gets too heated, we may need to press pause, shut it down, and restart. Because I want it to be a conversation, not a shouting match. As a people pleaser, that's what I want to do. Everything's just fine. If this doesn't work, I will be the one to adjust. And I've done that a lot in my life because I feel it's a lot easier to adjust and avoid any conflict. But what I recognize now, and that I've actually realized over and over, but something that I'm not truly getting. In any case, what I realized that I'm doing with my podcast again in life is I go against my original intention, what I wanted to do. I adjusted around something, the discomfort, the subconscious, whatever it is or was. And when I do that, it's not really what I want to do. And eventually it breaks down because it's inauthentic. The podcast stumbled because it was inauthentic. It was a good start. It got the ball rolling. And then it's taken me a year to think about it and write several episodes and even record some. And we'll drop them here to fill in the spaces as needed and bonus things. I already talked about Here Comes the Pride, and I've got another one about Thanksgiving dinner that are already recorded. I think that might even be the Thanksgiving one. But in any case, I've been doing those things, and they will be utilized here, but it's not where I wanted this to go. So the podcast, like life, started down a path. I recognized it was off, but adjusted. I was walking down and getting further and further apart instead of realizing I could just turn around, start holding hands with the podcast I wanted, and walk down the path together. I guess we wouldn't be holding hands in that case, but my point is that when I saw the first crack, I am the one who adjusted instead of saying, let's pause. I want to use the example, or an example that I think many of us have heard or seen some variation. Something about an axe or a wedge in a tree that gets left there. The tree goes up around it, and it's a miracle. You can even see the axe poking out. People come and try to pull it out, and it's stuck in the tree. But the tree is resilient. It's come back around and formed together around that wedge, but the wedge wasn't actually dealt with. And what happens years from now? The tree goes up around it, but it gets weak, eventually splits, falls apart, and dies. We sat and marveled at it for years, how the tree, this marvel of nature built around the wedge, encompassed it. But by leaving it there, all we did was prolong the inevitable. If we'd have taken it out, the tree might have died, yes. But we could have immediately planted a new one that would have been, yes, however much shorter than the original one that was there. But there. You also could have removed the wedge, braced the tree back together and helped it grow. Then you could have supported it from the outside, realizing that it had come back together. But there is still the gap where the wedge went in. And those two portions are never going to grow back into each other, back together completely. But if you leave the wedge in the crack, the split goes all the way up the tree, which is why 100 years from now, it splits, falls, and dies unexpectedly. I want this podcast to acknowledge the wedge, remove it, and figure out how to come together again. Because we're all one tree. We're all humanity. We are all in this together, and we succeed or fail together. Truly, I want the world to be better. I want my world to be better. My immediate family, friends, and the people I interact with every day. Not the bigger world. But when our immediate surroundings have wedges between us and them, the bigger world has all of those wedges, our wedges. Now that said, there's another positunity that came up on this New Year's celebration. It's a quote that I heard once, and I've written it down in my office so I can see it every single day. Obsessed with optimism, I still have a few things that I've not been able to find the silver lining. Not many, And that's not to say that I regret anything in my life. Everything is a learning and growing experience. But something came up in conversation that reminded me of my quote. Because the conversation steered one of these situations. It steered toward one of these situations where I often get a little uncomfortable and go quiet, people pleaser. I wasn't quiet in this conversation, though. I spoke my truth, but I didn't share my quote. If you're unable to find the positunity in a situation, a person, a place, whatever, the quote is about a person, but it can be replaced with these other options. Remember, sometimes forgiving someone in silence and then never speaking to them again is a form of self-care. Unquote. If you are unable to find the bright side, then let it go completely. Accept that it is what it is, what's done is done, and move on. Trying to make sense or force something to fit doesn't fix it. Like a sore, it just irritates it. If you leave it alone, it doesn't really go away. It just isn't your problem anymore. Like Sushi Dad and our gay table on New Year's Eve, there could not have been two more different tables in that restaurant that evening. The gap was deep, but he didn't even look down. Instead, he found out where we could come together in a note because he could. We could. He reached across, regardless of how deep. So join me on the journey, on your journey. Instead of being a passive rider on the journey of your life, I'm not saying that I was passive, but I consciously made the adjustment and made the wedge okay instead of dealing with it. I guess what I'm asking is for you to join me on the journey, removing wedges and coming together. I want to have guests, yes, but I will start by talking about the things that are happening every day and the things that I see that maybe could bring us together. So as you listen to the podcast, please send me an email at positunity@gmail.com. If you're listening to the podcast, have a comment, put it on the podcast episode you're listening to. If you're listening to the podcast on Facebook, leave a comment there. That's where I'm going to announce the episode. So leave a comment there. If you're listening to the podcast on your favorite platform and you have something to say, put it there. Or if you want to know more, go to the website. It will continue to grow as we get more things that I've talked about. I'll put the episodes on there and have discussions there. I want this to be interactive again. I want to posit unity for all of us. Positunity. One of the things that I wanted to do with the relaunch was audio and video. So depending on your platform, you can listen or watch. YouTube and Facebook should have the video podcasts, and it will expand as those options become more readily available. I'm probably never going to watch the episodes. I don't even like listening to myself. But you can. Thanks again for listening, and please remember to reach out on our social channels, Facebook and Insta at Positunity, or through the podcast directly through the website at positunity.org, net and biz, or through our email, positunity@gmail.com. Be well, and thank you for listening.